Hello class, welcome to week 8 of Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to discuss The Paradoxes of Time Travel by American philosopher, 20th century American philosopher David Lewis. And in the course of this discussion, we'll take on some broader questions having to do with the metaphysics or ontology of time. So here I am in my time machine, and let's take a look at a little presentation I put together to help us walk through this. So the general argument that David Lewis is going to attempt to undermine takes on this form. So premise 1, time travel gives rise to paradoxes. Premise 2, if time travel were possible, then paradoxes would be possible. Premise 3, paradoxes are not possible. Conclusion, therefore, time travel is not possible. Now, the goal of David Lewis's paper here, his strategy, is to undermine premise 1. Right? So he accepts as true the content of both premise 2 and 3, but he rejects premise 1, and the paper is constituted out of a few arguments in which he addresses purported paradoxes that have been presented at different times through these debates, to show that what appears on the surface to be paradoxical, or in other words, contradictory, is actually not so. And so some of the arguments that point to an alleged paradox will be shown to be invalid in the terms of deductive logic or natural deduction, which we've talked about in different contexts before. But sometimes we'll simply show that the argument is unsound by calling attention to at least one objectionable premise. So in the case of this argument, it turns out to be valid, structurally speaking, but at least one of the premises, in this case, premise 1, turns out to be false, or at least arguably flawed. So let's talk a little bit about time more generally. So the topology of time, in other words, the essential structure of time in which its elements cohere together. So we can talk about time as being bounded or unbounded. That is to say, infinite or finite. Was there a beginning to the known universe, or has it always existed? Which is what Aristotle thought, for example, in the ancient Greeks, that time is, at the cosmic level, eternal, which means it is in some sense, that is outside of time. Is it linear or closed? So does time travel in a linear pathway or trajectory, or is it actually closer to what the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche hypothesized, well, according to some interpretations of this aspect of his thought, that there is an eternal recurrence of the same, or kind of eternal return, according to which time is actually a flattened circle. So from our subjective orientation to it in the course of our lived experiential time, it appears to be very much so linear or straight, moving irrevocably from the past into the future. But it could just be that the circle, as it were, is turned flat, but it's really just a constant pattern of repetition. Another question would be, is time branching or non-branching? That is to say, are there parallel worlds that open up, and not just a matter of possibility, but do these parallel worlds that open up on the basis of different actions and decisions that one makes in the course of their experience, do these possible worlds actually exist in some way? Among other contributions to philosophy, David Lewis advances arguments in the context of modal realism, according to which possible worlds with certain conceptual limitations in place are actually real. And then some problems. Is determinism the case in a fatalistic sense, such that what is the future now is determined to be the future in an inexorable way, so a way that cannot be altered by changes in action or decision? And then connected to these issues would be the problem of time travel. Is it possible? Well, let's look very quickly at, so I mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche before. So this is the idea of the eternal return. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's not explicitly connected to the worry over the possibility of time travel and its associated paradoxes, but it is very much interesting. So I'll leave this here for you, but some interpret this thought experiment, the eternal return, as a kind of way of evaluating the quality and character of one's own lived existence. And so how you respond to the questions proposed by this demonic figure within the course of the thought experiment will demonstrate certain symptoms as to whether or not your own orientation to your own lived existence is healthy or diseased. Is it affirmative or negative to a pathological sense? So if everything you did had to be repeated over and over again, would you affirm that as great despite all the pain and misery and tribulations that you undergo? Or would you take a more nihilistic point of view and say, as the protagonist here seems to, that that would be the worst news ever brought? But let's look at a few assumptions at work behind Lewis's argumentation. So Lewis advocates for a view known as temporal parts. And we discussed this briefly in the context at the beginning of this term of John Perry's dialogue on personal identity and immortality. And so Lewis has this idea that existing things which endure through time are constituted not only out of spatial parts. So using my own body as an example, I, as an articulated whole, am constituted out of the parts of my various appendages, my head, my torso, the organs that make up the functionality of my bodily systems and so forth. But equally, I'm constituted out of the past moments of my own experience, which relate to each other in a particularly ordered causal way, such that I can look back and say that I was the same person who was performing action X, say 25 years ago, because I can look at the distance between that moment in time and my presence in the world and how I'm existing right now as a series of interrelated causal pieces, or as Lewis puts them, temporal parts. And so that's the criterion for personal identity, according to Lewis. Another issue is this distinction between external and personal time, we'll talk about in just a moment. And that's encountered in the very first of the series of paradoxes that he entertains. So we occupy another important presupposition in the background of Lewis's presentation here, is that we occupy a four-dimensional world. So the world of the time traveler, as well as our own, is four-dimensional, and time is just one of those four dimensions, like the spatial ones, except that time remains one-dimensional, since there can be no two time-like dimensions that are orthogonal or that intersect each other. Enduring things are time-like streaks, he says, and so you can look at the streak as being built incrementally out of these various temporal parts that constitute any individual physical thing. Temporal parts or stages that are located at various times and places. So change is a qualitative difference between different stages, in other words, different temporal parts of some enduring thing, just as a change in scenery from east to west. So if you're traveling, say from the west coast to the east coast, you'll notice various qualitative changes, differences in the environment. These are just qualitative differences between the eastern and western spatial parts of the landscape that you're traversing. And so this is a graphic representation of Lewis's understanding of time's arrow, which takes on this kind of worm-like topology. And so the worm view, according to Lewis, is that enduring existing things are space-time worms that are composed of temporal parts or person stages, as it was put in the Perry dialogue specifically. And so each little chunk that you can pull out that makes up the components of the so-called worm would be those individual stages that are importantly related to each other in unique causal ways. Varieties of time travel. Well, what is time travel? Lewis defines it as the time elapsed from departure to arrival is the duration of the journey, but, and this is what separates the time traveler's navigation of the world from an ordinary person's, for the time traveler, the separation in time between departure and arrival does not equal the duration of his journey. And there are different ways to thematize or to conceptualize traveling through time in this unique way, or different, that is, strange, unusual way. Back to the future, so time travel to the past and the back, and then back or to the future and back, in which case we're considering time as linear. Around to the past, so if the space-time structure is essentially curved, whether positively or negatively, then traveling through time in this unusual way would amount to kind of navigation of that curvature. Okay. So personal time, remember he makes this important distinction between personal time and external time. So how could it be that the same two events were separated by two unequal amounts of time? Lewis says, I reply by distinguishing time itself, which he calls external time, as I shall call it, from the personal time of a particular time traveler, roughly that which is measured by his wristwatch. But that's a kind of operational distinction there, using the idea or image of the wristwatch. Personal time would still exist even if we didn't have these various timekeeping pieces of technology. So using this timeline to understand, for instance, a historical figure like Julius Caesar. So this is Julius Caesar's personal time. He's born, he travels forward, as we all do, and then he dies at a particular historical moment. And that tracks, as in the case of all of our ordinary temporal experience, the external time, where he is born roughly 100 BC, and then dies March 1544 BC here. Okay, so the first paradox. Premise one, if time travel is possible, then the time separating Tim's departure from Tim's arrival is 5 minutes. Premise two, if time travel is possible, then the time separating Tim's departure from Tim's arrival is 40 years. The time separating Tim's departure and arrival cannot both be 5 minutes and 40 years. Therefore, we can conclude, since this brings us to a paradox, that time travel is impossible or not possible. But here's where it says we have to distinguish between personal time and external time. So personal time is the time that's measured, if he were wearing one, by Tim's wristwatch. External time is what we call real time, objective time, maybe. So in reality, let's say there are 40 years separating the moment of Tim's departure in his time machine and the moment of his arrival 40 years later. So in Tim's personal time, this process of traversing those 40 years only took 5 minutes. But from the perspective of external time or objective time, 40 years elapsed. So how is that possible? Well, I'm going to stop the video here and then I'll resume it in part 2.